Months turned into years, and her name faded from the headlines. People moved on, but in the towns near the mountain, the silence around her story only grew heavier. Hikers reported hearing voices in the fog, not shouts but murmurs, like a conversation just out of earshot. A few swore they saw a pale figure watching from the tree line, vanishing when approached. One man, a hunter, claimed he found the cabin again, but when he went inside, it wasn't abandoned. The floor had been repaired. New furniture, hand-carved, stood where the rot had been. On the mantel was a framed photograph. The girl, older now, standing beside a man whose face seemed too familiar to be a coincidence. He took one step closer, and the man in the photograph seemed to look back at him. He never returned to the mountain after that. The state eventually closed the file. Unresolved was the final word in the report, but the archivist who handled the documents said there was one entry she couldn't stop thinking about. A handwritten note, undated, slipped between the family records. It read, "We keep to ourselves because we must. Outside blood cannot survive here." Some see that as proof of superstition. Others read it as a warning, not for the family but for the rest of us. Maybe the mountain wasn't keeping them in. Maybe it was keeping something else from getting out. And if that's true, then the girl wasn't the last of her kind. She was just the one we happened to find. Even now, on cold nights, the wind carries strange sounds down from those peaks. They don't quite match the calls of animals, and they're not the voices of hikers. They're softer, slower, almost human. And if you ever hear them while walking alone in those woods, the locals have one piece of advice: don't answer. Because if you do, you might hear a voice you recognize, one you've never met, but that somehow knows your name. And if that happens, you'll wish you'd never looked up at all. By now, the town had turned her into a kind of legend, half pity, half fear. Some claimed she was cursed, others whispered that she was the last of something older than the town itself. But the truth lay buried in those archives, in brittle pages no one wanted to keep reading. A genealogist brought in by the state traced her family line back to a single couple who'd settled in those mountains before the Civil War. From there, the bloodline folded in on itself over and over, with marriages between siblings, uncles to nieces, cousins to cousins, until the family tree wasn't a tree at all. It was a closed circle. Every so often, one of them would come down the mountain. Always a man, always alone. He'd buy supplies, flour, salt, tools, and vanish before anyone could ask questions. The dates of these sightings stretched back more than a century, and the descriptions barely changed. Tall, pale, eyes too light to forget. Some swore it was the same man every time. When the girl was shown an old tintype photograph from 1892, she traced her finger over one of the faces and whispered a single word. "Father." She said it the same way she said it now, with certainty, not confusion, as if time meant nothing to the man she was pointing to. Investigators started to wonder if the family believed in something more than isolation, a creed, a belief that keeping the blood pure wasn't just tradition, but protection against something they feared outside the mountain. The girl hinted at it once, late at night, telling a social worker, "He says if we mix, we disappear." Disappear, not die, not change, disappear. The more they pressed her, the more she shut down, until she finally stopped speaking altogether. Weeks later, she was gone, slipped out of the care home without a trace. No broken locks, no forced entry, just an open window on the third floor. The only clue left behind was a single muddy footprint on the sill, far too large to be hers. Some believe she went back to the mountains willingly. Others think she was taken, but the mountains don't answer questions, they only keep their own. It would have been easy to call her story a tragedy and file it away, but the truth was more tangled than anyone wanted to admit. The state sent in caseworkers, psychologists, and investigators, each one certain they could fix her. But after only a few weeks in care, the reports started to sound the same. Nightmares, refusal to eat, staring at corners of the room as if something stood there just beyond sight. One worker noted that she never slept through the night. She would sit upright in bed for hours, hands gripping the blanket, rocking back and forth and murmuring to herself. The words were faint, almost unintelligible, but one phrase kept appearing in the notes. "Don't let him in." The strangest part, several staff members claimed they heard knocking on the windows at night, not the frantic kind, slow, deliberate knocks, like someone keeping time. The facility was 3 stories up. There were no trees close enough for branches to tap the glass. When they tried to bring her back to the cabin to jog her memory, she refused to get out of the car. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just went still, her breathing shallow, her eyes fixed on the tree line. The driver swore he saw a shadow move between the pines, tall, unmistakably human, but when they checked, there was nothing there. Over time, the girl began to tell her story in fragments, about the man who lived in the back room, about how he told her never to go outside during the day because people out there would take you away. She said the mountain wasn't just their home, it was their protection, that outsiders would never understand what was pure. That word, pure, came up often, too often. It wasn't the way a child should say it, not with that kind of reverence. It was a word she'd been taught, repeated to her like scripture, and when they asked who taught it to her, she only said, "Father," and his father before him. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you have stayed in the mountains? Or run, knowing what was behind you might follow? They called her the Mountain Girl in the papers, but the name didn't stick in town. Locals still whispered her real name, almost like an incantation, soft, careful, as if saying it too loud might call her back. What struck everyone was how she reacted when shown photographs from the town archives, faces she shouldn't have known, buildings she had never visited, yet every time they slid an image across the table, her eyes locked on one detail. A person, always in the background, standing just far enough away to blur. The investigators were desperate for answers, so they pressed her gently, showing her the same figure across decades of photos. The man never seemed to age, same tall frame, same slope of the shoulders, same cold stare, and every time she saw him, her lips would curl into something that wasn't quite a smile, more like recognition. Her story began to leak out in pieces, through scribbles she made on scraps of paper, through single words she'd whisper at night, thinking no one was listening. The clearest phrase they ever caught was one that sent a chill through every man in the room. "He's my father, and he's still there." One of the deputies swore that after hearing it, he dreamed of that cabin for weeks. In the dream, he was climbing the mountain again, but the higher he went, the quieter the world became. No wind, no birds, just a heavy stillness until the cabin appeared, and someone was standing in the doorway, watching. They went back to the site weeks later. By then the cabin was empty, stripped bare, furniture gone, floorboards pried up, but on one wall, in faint, uneven letters, someone had written a date, 1914, a date that didn't match her birth, or her parents, or even the cabin's construction. But there was one thing in the room they missed at first, a section of the floor where the dirt felt different, softer. They dug until they hit wood, an old box sealed with rusted nails. Inside were bones, small, fragile, too small to belong to an adult. The coroner couldn't place the age with certainty, but his guess was somewhere between 5 and 7 years old. The girl never spoke about the box. She never asked what was inside. She just stared at it the way you'd stare at an old photograph you wish you could forget. They started piecing her history together the way you piece together a broken mirror, slowly, carefully, knowing each shard could cut you. In the county archives, there were land deeds that went back over 100 years, all tied to the same surname. That name kept appearing in birth records too, but never with an outside family. Every father shared a bloodline with the mother. Sometimes they were first cousins, sometimes closer. The deeper you looked, the more the branches of the family tree didn't spread. They curled inward, looping back into themselves like something suffocating its own roots. And with each generation, the records became more erratic. Misspelled names, children with no fathers listed, death certificates with causes that read more like guesses than facts, fever, accident, unknown. People who had lived near the base of the mountain said they'd occasionally see a figure at night, moving along the ridgeline, carrying what looked like bundles. No one ever went up to check, not because they didn't care, but because they did, because they knew what lived up there wasn't meant to come down. When the girl was finally brought into town, the doctors noticed something they didn't put in the press. Her speech was slurred, but not from fear. Her jawline was misshapen, her teeth crowded in unnatural ways. Her eyes didn't quite align. One seemed to drift, just slightly, and her skin carried the kind of pallor that spoke of more than just a life without sunlight. The old-timers said she looked like her grandfather, not her father, her grandfather. And then, with a look like they'd said too much, they'd correct themselves and call it a coincidence. But the dates in the county ledgers made it impossible to ignore. Her father and her grandfather were the same man. What's worse, the girl wasn't the only child in that cabin. She was just the only one where Ho lived. The search team found small beds, some nothing more than rags on the floor. They found a locked trunk with children's clothes, all worn through at the knees and elbows. And they found drawings, crude, almost childlike, but filled with strange shapes and figures that didn't seem to belong to a child's imagination. No one could agree on what they meant, but every single drawing had the same detail: a woman's face, always watching, always smiling. They said the mountains kept her hidden, but that wasn't the truth. The truth was that the mountains were the only thing standing between her and the rest of the world. When they found her, she was barefoot, hair matted into ropes, her skin a pale shade that looked as if it had never seen summer. She didn't speak at first, just stared, wide, unblinking, as if we were the strangers. And she was the one who had been here all along. The locals whispered about her for decades before anyone dared to climb high enough to find out if she was real. An inbred girl. The words rolled off their tongues in half shame, half fascination. They claimed her parents were brother and sister, or maybe uncle and niece, depending on which old man at the gas station you asked. And they said the family had been up there for so long that they'd forgotten the rest of the world even existed. The thing about secrets in small towns is, they're not really secrets. They're warnings, the kind you tell your kids in the dark to keep them from wandering too far up the wrong road. And she was the ultimate warning, a living consequence of generations who wouldn't marry outside their own blood. When the search party first reached the cabin, they said the smell hit before they even saw the place: damp wood, unwashed skin, a rot that had no single source, like it was baked into the walls. The girl was sitting on the floor when they opened the door, her knees pulled tight against her chest, her eyes darting between the men, as if deciding which one might kill her first. But here's the part they don't put in the official report. There were other voices in that cabin, not alive, not anymore, just faint echoes, the sound of someone whispering her name. The kind of sound that sticks in your head long after you've left, making you wonder if you brought a piece of that place home with you. Her name. Wasn't in any school records, no hospital birth certificate. The county clerk said it was like she didn't exist, but someone had raised her, someone had taught her just enough to survive, and someone had kept her hidden on purpose. And the reason why, that's where this story gets dark. It happened in the early 2000s, when the internet began pulling apart the last veils of secrecy in places the world had ignored for generations. A photographer with a taste for the strange and unsettling heard whispers about the family in the valley. Unlike journalists before him, he didn't come with a crew or a news van. He came alone, with only a camera and an iron stomach for discomfort. His images, when they surfaced online, caused an explosion of morbid fascination. Faces that seemed sculpted by centuries of the same hand, eyes pointing in different directions, expressions caught between childlike innocence and something harder to name. Some viewers reacted with pity, others with disgust, but most with the same gnawing question: how could this still exist in modern America? The family, suddenly aware of outsiders peering into their lives, reacted with quiet rage. Visitors were chased off more aggressively. Roads leading toward their land began to sprout hand-painted signs warning trespassers to turn back. But the damage was done. The valley's name was whispered in forums, its location guessed at and traded in private messages. The more they tried to hide, the more people wanted to see. Documentarians followed. Some came under the guise of charity, others for raw spectacle. A few managed to gain the family's wary trust, exchanging small comforts, groceries, clothes, for the right to film. What they captured was both haunting and deeply human. Laughter around fire pits, siblings clinging to each other, but also sudden bursts of violence, screams from unseen rooms, and moments where a smile would flicker into something far colder. For many viewers, these videos confirmed what they had feared: the genetic damage was irreversible. But for others, it raised a darker thought. Perhaps this was never meant to be fixed. Perhaps the family didn't want saving. Today, the valley still stands. The land is still theirs. And while the road in is more overgrown than ever, there are still those who seek it: curiosity, pity, or the thrill of looking at something you were never meant to see pulling them forward. But be careful if you go looking. Some stories don't want to be found, and some bloodlines don't take kindly to strangers.